I'm sure you've heard the saying, life imitates art, right? Well, in this particular case, that's true. Nancy Crampton Brophy is a romance novelist who, as we speak, is standing trial in Portland, Oregon for the murder of her husband. Brophy is accused of shooting her husband of 27 years, 63-year-old Chef Daniel Brophy. On the morning of June 2, 2018, Chef Brophy arrived alone at the Oregon Culinary Institute where he taught. He disarmed the alarm at 7:21 a.m. and once inside, he was shot twice. Once in the back while he stood preparing for work, and then once as he lay dying on the ground. By 7:30 a.m., his colleagues and students began to arrive, but no one found him until a student went into the back kitchen at 8 a.m. and she stumbled upon him laying on the floor. Attempts to revive him were made, but he died on the scene. The medical examiner later stated that both shots would have killed him as they both punctured his heart. Surveillance video from the scene shows his wife, 68-year-old Nancy Brophy, arriving at the institute minutes before her husband. It then shows her leaving at 7:28 a.m., moments after he was shot. What captured the attention of many of us in this case is that in 2011, Nancy Brophy, who has written dozens of romance novels, penned a 700-word essay called How to Murder Your Husband. The essay was published on a blog called See Jane Publish, and it featured 5 different reasons you might want to kill your husband. This included financial gain, lying and cheating, falling in love with another person, abuse, or you're just a professional murder for hire. She suggested using guns, knives, a heavy object, or even a garrote. Now, the point of the essay isn't explicitly stated, but it does seem like she's just helping other writers with plots on their books. But perhaps Nancy followed the plot of one of her own suggestions. Because according to the prosecutor, Nancy took over 10 different life insurance policies out on her husband, and they would have paid her over $1 million if he died. After Daniel's death, when police were investigating, Nancy asked police, which was caught on recording, if they could write her a letter to give her insurance company stating that she was not a suspect in her husband's murder. Now, the judge in this case has decided that the essay will not be evidence in this case, but I think they have a pretty strong case even without it. Her vehicle's caught on surveillance. She took out policies on his life. There's a Google search showing that she purchased a gun. She paid $16,000 in insurance premiums, yet defaulted on her mortgage. Let's see how this trial unfolds. I'll bring you an update soon. This is Erin Reynolds. After battling and beating cancer at just the age of 14, she hoped to grow up and become something special. Maybe a teacher, a nurse, or a marine biologist. But she didn't get to grow up and be any of those things because at the age of 16, she was murdered by someone she thought was her friend. Erin met a boy named Conrad Engweiler. He was a year younger, but they were both new at Sunset High School in Beaverton, Oregon, so they bonded and became friends. Since she already had her license, she would often drive Conrad in exchange for a bit of gas money. But when he started getting into trouble at school and appeared to have issues with drugs, she began to distance herself. On the night of February 21st, 1990, Erin missed her curfew and immediately put her parents on edge. After about an hour, they called police to report her missing. Little did her parents know that when she left that evening, she was intercepted by 15-year-old Engweiler. He had been waiting outside her home so that he could ask her to give him a ride home. And once they got to his home, he demanded her keys. When she didn't hand them over, he forced her out of the car. Engweiler grabbed rope and a knife that he had stashed by a tree earlier that night. When she realized what was happening and began to scream for help, he hit her over the head and caused her to bleed. He then chased her across the lawn, demanding her keys, which she dropped. The two were then forced on hands and knees looking for the keys. He got so angry that he ended up forcing her back into the car where he raped and sodomized her. He then wrapped the rope around her neck 3 times and strangled her to death. After she was dead, he hit her repeatedly over the head with a vodka bottle. Then he covered her body in yard debris in front of his house. The next morning, Engweiler's father couldn't find him, and when he went outside, he saw someone else's car in the driveway, called police, and when they arrived, they found her body in the front yard. Engweiler was originally sentenced to an indeterminate life term, but that was then changed to a 30-year minimum and eventually a 40-year minimum. But after years of trying, he was granted parole in 2014. Erin's family never wanted him out of prison. They are adamant that he's a threat to society and will kill again. And now he's out of prison and on parole, but he's recently requested that the parole be terminated. Erin's family has asked you for support. We have 3 days left to write the parole board to ask that they keep him on parole. He's demonstrated that he doesn't respect the family. He even showed up at one of her family members' work to intimidate them. If you want to write a letter to request that Conrad Engweiler stay on parole, you can email Robin Masella, email here, and put the subject line Engweiler. This is Angela McAnulty, and I'm going to tell you the story about how she became one of Oregon's most notorious monster moms, part 1. 18-year-old Nancy Fusey gave birth to her third child, Angela Darlene Fusey, on October 2nd, 1968 in Sacramento, California. Her relationship with Jerry Fusey, Angela's father, was tumultuous to say the least. Not only did he have an affair, but it resulted in a secret family. At 23 years old, Nancy Fusey was brutally murdered, and though no one has gone to jail for it, most people think it was Jerry. That's a video for another time. After the murder of her mother, Angela was raised by Jerry and the mother of his secret child, Rebecca. One of Angela's brothers, George, wrote a book about the abuse that they suffered at the hands of their father their entire childhood. Needless to say, all of the kids escaped as soon as they could. At the age of 16, Angela left home to be with a carnival worker by the name of Anthony Maples. The pair eventually had 3 children together, Anthony Jr., Brandon, and Jeanette. When Jeanette was just a year old, Angela and Anthony got arrested. They were selling drugs. Not only did they go to jail, but the 3 children went into foster care. After doing her time and kicking her drug habit, Angela left jail to start her new life. She met a new man and had her 4th child, Patience. The court decided they would give Angela the opportunity to have her children back, but they asked the kids what they wanted to do. Her 2 oldest sons, who could remember her, opted to stay in foster care, but the younger, Jeanette, didn't remember her mother and wanted to learn about her and her new baby sister, so she moved in. Angela is now single, but she has custody of 2 of her 4 children, and this is when she meets Richard McAnulty. They get married and have a son together. Now, around this time, her extended family has some red flags going up about how she treats Jeanette. The other 2 kids are treated with love and understanding, but Jeanette, for some reason, is picked on by her mother. These red flags only become worse as the family picks up and leaves California to move to Eugene, Oregon. While living in Eugene, the people in Jeanette's life start to notice she's being mistreated. She has all of the telltale signs, bruises, timidity, she's constantly hungry, and so they start to complain to CPS that someone needs to check on Jeanette. I'm talking everybody. Grandma, friends at school, their parents, teachers, the cafeteria worker, everyone called CPS. Jeanette even wrote a letter to a school official detailing that her mother hits her and starves her at home. CPS eventually opens up a case and goes to the house, but Angela tells them her daughter is a compulsive liar. So what do? They close the case. Not long after the case is closed, Angela pulls Jeanette out of public school and begins to homeschool her. This is the beginning to her end. Go to part 2. This is part 2 of Angela McAnulty, the Monster Mom. On December 9th, 2009, a 911 call was made in Eugene, Oregon, claiming that a teenage girl was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived at the McAnulty residence to find Angela McAnulty on the lawn screaming for help. Once inside, they found 15-year-old Jeanette Maples on the floor, unresponsive. Jeanette was drenched in water, partially dressed, and visibly malnourished. She had open wounds all over her body, some of which were so severe you could see the bone. Her patchy, thinning hair did nothing to hide the fact that there was a giant, circular, bloody wound in the back of her head. Jeanette was rushed to the hospital, but nothing could be done and she was pronounced dead. The medical examiner counted 200 open wounds on her body. She was so malnourished that she weighed only 50 pounds, which is less than half of what you would expect a 15-year-old to weigh. Even Jeanette's face showed the severity of the torture she endured at the hands of her mother. Her lips were deformed because they kept healing over and over without medical attention. Nearly every single one of her teeth were chipped or missing. The medical examiner testified that someone in the household took a regular household knife to cut away infected skin from Jeanette's body, likely without an anesthetic. There were multiple reasons Jeanette could have died. She had pneumonia, she had bleeding on her brain. She had been starved so long that she had 0 body fat and hardly any muscle. She had so many injuries and infections that it was impossible to know which one ultimately caused her death. So the medical examiner listed it as multifactorial neglect and abuse. The forensic search of the home was like a house of horrors. Jeanette's blood and pieces of her skin were literally on every wall of the house and sometimes even the ceiling. She was forced to sleep in a back bedroom on a piece of cardboard on the floor, and that cardboard was completely stained in her own blood. Richard and Angela McAnulty were both arrested and convicted for the murder of their daughter. Richard received 25 years. Angela was originally sentenced to death and was the only woman on death row. But in 2016, she got new lawyers who were able to convince the judge that she deserved a new trial. Her original lawyers were actually trying 2 high-profile capital punishment cases at the same time, and they were able to prove that they really dropped the ball on her case. In 2018, the judge approves that she can have a new trial, and in 2019, the law changes around capital punishment. This means she no longer qualifies for it. In 2020, the DA and the defense come to an agreement, and she goes away for life without parole. She won't get out, but she gets her life, unlike her daughter. The Murder of Linda Wilkes, Part 1. Why don't people fully listen to rape victims? On September 4th, 1975, 21-year-old Linda Wilkes was raped at gunpoint by a man who invaded her Roseburg, Oregon home. The man had watched outside as her husband left the home, and then he snuck in through an unlocked door. After he raped her, he warned Linda that he would kill her if she told anyone. Linda went to police and told them she was raped and that the man had threatened to kill her if she told anyone. Later that night, they arrested Dennis Leroy Gordon, a 27-year-old man from the Dalles. Within hours, he met his $25,000 bail and chartered a private plane home. Life went on, right? Wrong. 2 weeks later, Linda didn't arrive to pick up her husband from work like they planned. She was missing. Her husband called police and a search began. Within 3 hours, they located her 2 youngest children abandoned in their family car. Their 2-year-old and 6-month-old were covered in blood. The 2-year-old was whimpering and crying for his mother. Then nearby, they found Linda's decapitated body. Go to Part 2. The Murder of Linda Wilkes, Part 2. Linda Wilkes' decapitated body was found less than a mile from where they discovered her 2 children bloodied and abandoned. Police quickly arrested Dennis Leroy Gordon, who had raped her 2 weeks prior. He claimed he killed the woman because she stole a knife out of his glove box and tried to stab him. But eventually he told the truth. He chartered a private plane to Roseburg and then stood outside of her house and waited. Once he was sure that the husband wasn't home, he went straight through the door and threatened her with a gun. He forced her to leave with him, but she wouldn't leave without her children. The 4 of them piled into the car and he drove her out of town. Right in front of her children, he stabbed her in the chest and abdomen and killed her. He then took her body and laid it on the back seat of the floor where her son could gaze upon her as he drove out of town. He then cut her head off with a knife, buried her body, abandoned the kids in the car, stole a truck, and left with her head. He then stopped to change his clothes, bury the head, and fly home. He did plead guilty. He got a life sentence plus 20 years, but he's up for parole in 2024. This is the case of the missing Oregon City girls, Part 1. In January of 2002, 12-year-old Ashley Pond goes missing while on her way to the school bus stop. Initially, it was easy to write her off as a runaway. She had a rough life. When she was 9, her parents got a messy divorce and her father asked for a paternity test. That's when she found out he was not her biological father. She then started forced visitation with her biological father, who over the span of 4 years sexually abused her. She finally told her mother and he was arrested, and they took him to court on 40 counts of rape and child sex abuse. But he pled out and got off with hardly any jail time. So when she goes missing, people are quick to write it off as a sad teen looking for a new life. But 2 months later, when her best friend Miranda Gaddis goes missing, people start to pay attention. Residents begin to panic that there's a child serial killer on the loose. Finally, police take this seriously and the FBI gets involved, and they start looking into the people in these girls' lives. Go to Part 2. This is the case of the missing Oregon City girls, Part 2. Now that police are seriously investigating the disappearance of 12-year-old Ashley and 13-year-old Miranda, they realize just how vulnerable these girls really were. Like Ashley, Miranda had been sexually abused when she was younger. Not only did her father go to prison for it, but her mother's boyfriend went to prison too. She actually lived in foster care for a short time. She eventually got to move back in with her mom, where they lived in the same low-income apartments as Ashley. Investigators soon realized they have over 28 suspects at that apartment complex alone. So they go one by one trying to rule them out. Then something interesting happens. Interview after interview, the same name keeps coming up. a man named Ward Weaver. Weaver not only lived nearby, he knew the girls. They were friends with his daughter. They even slept over at his house. Go to part 3 to learn about Ward Weaver and how he became the primary suspect. This is the case of the missing Oregon City girls, part 3. Investigators spent months chasing leads in the case of the missing Oregon City girls, and after clearing dozens of suspects, they set their sights on one man, Ward Weaver III. The Weavers had a home just feet from Ashley and Miranda's apartments. In fact, they were friends with his daughter and often spent the night. And when police look into the kind of relationship he had with the girls, they uncovered some very disturbing information. They speak to one teacher who said at school she witnessed a very disturbing exchange between 12-year-old Ashley and 39-year-old Ward Weaver. As she sat at her desk, looking out the window, she saw Ashley in a truck with Ward. She climbed on his lap, cuddled him, and then they exchanged a long kiss. She called DHS multiple times and nothing happened. And she's not the only one. Another teacher called DHS to let them know that Ashley confided in her that she had been molested on a 2-week vacation with the Weaver family. Go to part 4. This is the case of the missing Oregon City girls, part 4. Clearly, there was a lot to unpack with the relationship between 12-year-old Ashley and 39-year-old Ward Weaver, but to the public, it looked like police and FBI were doing absolutely nothing. It seemed like everyone knew who Ward Weaver was, and everyone wondered why wasn't he being arrested. And then a haunting interview takes place, one that people in Oregon are likely not going to forget. K2 News heard whispers about Ward Weaver, so they sent Anna Song, one of the reporters, to interview him. During the interview, they walk through his home, and he casually leans against a freezer while talking about the missing girls, a freezer that witnesses say often was locked. They then walk outside across a brand new cement slab, one that another witness says was just recently put in after the girls disappeared. In August, he's finally arrested, but not for the missing girls. His son calls police to tell him he tried to rape his 19-year-old girlfriend. Go to part 5 to hear all of it. This is the case of the missing Oregon City girls, part 5. While Weaver's locked up for attempt of rape, police and FBI execute a search warrant on his residence, hoping to find any evidence of the missing girls. The first discovery was made within a few hours. Hundreds of flies were buzzing around a storage shed outside. They found dozens of boxes, and one of them drew their attention. Inside a microwave box was another smaller box wrapped and taped in plastic. Inside, they found the body of 13-year-old Miranda, who was naked and bound in the fetal position. Next, they moved to the concrete slab. After digging up the concrete, they find a 55-gallon barrel, and inside is the body of Ashley, who is also bound and wrapped in plastic. Their autopsy revealed that both girls were held in low temperatures for some period of time, perhaps a freezer. And while it was obvious these were homicides, the medical examiner couldn't quite pinpoint the cause of death. Go to part 6 to learn what happened to Weaver. This is the case of the missing Oregon City girls, part 6. Weaver was arrested for the murders of Ashley and Miranda and eventually convicted to 2 life sentences without parole. So why did he do it? Well, he groomed Ashley so he could repeatedly abuse her, and when she threatened to come forward and tell, he killed her. He was worried Miranda might have information on him, so he lured her to his house under the pretense that Ashley was inside and needed her help, and then he killed her to keep her quiet. Years later, Miranda's little sister visited Weaver in prison. In their conversation, he told her that he killed the girls with his bare hands and that she was next. In the end, this is a tragic case of a lifelong criminal who liked to rape children. And he is not very popular in prison. Somebody's already tried to kill him. What we can learn from this case is that often victims are not believed, and the agencies in place to protect children often fail. The Killer Weaver's Family History, Part 1. I recently did a 6-part video series about how Ward Weaver III murdered 2 teenage girls. His family history is a little bit crazy. Let's get into it. Let's start with his grandfather, Ward Weaver Sr. Granddaddy Weaver was known for sexually assaulting women. He sexually assaulted his wife, strangers, his daughters, and his grandchildren. Now on to his dad, Ward F. Pete Weaver Jr. Daddy Dearest, Ward Weaver Jr., went to jail in 1984. He was on death row for the murder of 18-year-old Robert Radford and his girlfriend, 23-year-old Barbara Leroy. He beat Robert to death with a pipe in the Mojave Desert and then repeatedly raped Barbara and strangled her with a cloth diaper. While on death row, he told other prisoners that he had killed before. There's speculation that he's a serial killer. You guys, there's more. Go to part 2. I promise it's good. The Killer Weaver Family History, part 2. Now on to his son, Francis Paul Weaver. If you recall, Francis had actually called police to report that his father tried to rape his 19-year-old girlfriend. That allowed them to arrest Ward Weaver III and then execute a search warrant. As much as he renounced his father's actions, that didn't stop him from committing murder himself. In 2014, he killed Edward Spangler in a drug deal gone wrong. I will say this, unlike his father and his grandfather, he did have regret over his actions. There's another son, Alex Weaver. Alex didn't kill anyone, but he did do 2 years in prison for assault. Doesn't he have a daughter? His daughter Mallory was actually friends with the 2 girls that he murdered. When she was still a child, she helped her father destroy evidence in that case. At the age of 21, she was arrested for assaulting a hospital security guard. So guys, is it nature or is it nurture? Amanda Jo Stott-Smith, Killer Mom, Part 1. In the middle of the night on May 23, 2009, a couple living along the Willamette River outside of Portland, Oregon, heard cries coming from the water. They got their flashlights and called police while another couple nearby got in their boat and searched for the source of the sound. 20 minutes later, they found a little girl floating in the water. They pulled her into the boat and realized there was another child in the water, a little boy younger than the first girl, and he was dead. Police circulated to the media that 2 kids were found in the dark, cold water. How did they get there? Did they fall out of a boat? Did they fall from the bridge? That's when the Stott family grew very concerned. Kathy and Mike Stott had 3 grandchildren. 1 was at home with them, 2 had been picked up by their mother and hadn't been home yet. They were due back hours ago. Kathy then calls the kid's father to ask if he'd heard from the kids or his ex-wife. He said he had, but she hung up on him. Jason and Kathy are now convinced that those kids belong to their family. Go to part 2 to hear more. Amanda Jo Stott-Smith, Killer Mom, Part 2. Both Jason, the father, and Kathy, the maternal grandmother, have called police multiple times trying to identify the children. Meanwhile, Jason's mom has called police to officially file a missing persons report. It was highly unlike their mom Amanda to take the kids and stay out of contact for so long. She'd been gone for hours and they were supposed to be back the night before. With every hour, Jason becomes more and more worried that the kids in the river are his. Sadly, police eventually confirm that the kids in the river are in fact 7-year-old Trinity and 4-year-old Eldon Smith. And even worse than that, little Eldon is dead. By late morning, police are scouring Portland looking for their mother, Amanda Jo Stott-Smith. They find her blue Audi parked in a parking garage in downtown Portland. When they go to confront her, she makes an attempt to jump off of the 9th story. That's when an officer is able to grab her and take her downtown for an interview where she tells them everything. Go to part 3 to learn. Amanda Jo Stott-Smith, Killer Mom, Part 3. Amanda is finally detained by police and they begin the painstaking job of trying to get her to tell them what happened that night. They are desperate to learn what she had done to her children. She begins to recount what happened that evening. She had visitation with her 2 youngest children. She lost parental rights over the eldest son, so he chose to stay home with his grandparents. She then takes Trinity and Eldon to downtown Portland so they can watch the fireworks that the Rose Festival puts on each year. When they couldn't find parking, Amanda grew incredibly frustrated. Then she decides to drive around town until the children fall asleep in the back seat. Then she does the unimaginable. She drives to the Selwood Bridge, picks up a sleeping Trinity, and throws her over the side. It's over a 90-foot drop. She picks up Eldon, who is now awake, and asks her, "Did you just put her in the water?" And then she drops him too. Go to part 4. Amanda Jo Stott-Smith, Killer Mom, Part 4. We just learned that Amanda threw her own children off of the side of a bridge. Everyone is baffled as to how a mother could do this to her own children. So many people have taken the time to try to figure out why she did it. Amanda struggled with an eating disorder and alcoholism most of her life. Her first love committed suicide when she was pregnant with his baby. Her marriage to Jason was abusive. There were multiple calls to CPS that the children had been neglected, some thinking that the eldest son was abused by his non-biological father, Jason. There's speculation in Amanda's family that she actually gave up custody of her oldest child to protect him from Jason. In court, they argued that Amanda killing her children was a form of filicide associated with people trying to seek revenge on their lovers, that she chose to do this to hurt Jason. After a deal with prosecution was made, Amanda was sentenced to life in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 35 years. This is the case of the Valentine's Day Suicide Pact. In 2005, a woman called Oregon police to let them know she stumbled across some very disturbing plans online. A man contacted her for a chat, and he went by the handle Suicide Party 2005. He kept asking her if she wanted to commit suicide, and then he invited her to a very special party at his house. The party would be a last hurrah filled with sex, and then the night would end with 30 people hanging themselves to commit suicide. When the woman learned that several of the guests were bringing their children, she called police. Police located Gerald Crean Jr., a severely depressed man who had been going online, finding vulnerable women and urging them to commit suicide. He was then arrested for solicitation to commit murder. Crean waived his right to a jury trial and instead stood before a judge. The judge convicted him for 20 years at the Oregon State Mental Hospital. Hopefully he can get the help he needs. This is the murder of Terri McCarthy, Part 1. On Valentine's Day in 1982, a state trooper was patrolling in Scappoose, Oregon. As he turned down a road next to the Memorial Gardens Cemetery, he noticed 2 abandoned backpacks. When he got out of the car to investigate, he thought he could hear someone talking, so he walked towards the sound. That's when he could see 2 dark figures in the night. One of them was hunched over the other, lying lifeless on the ground. As he brought his flashlight beam across the pair, a horrifying scene came into focus. He saw a man who was muttering to himself, "It's okay," as he was gouging out a woman's eyeballs. Somehow, he convinced the man to calmly walk with him back to the car. He put him in the back seat and called for backup. He then arrested Delmar Anholt Jr., who went on to tell him everything that happened that day. Check out Part 2 to hear all about how Anholt murdered his own girlfriend. This is the murder of Terri McCarthy, Part 2. Police arrest Anholt, and he details what happened between him and his longtime girlfriend, Terri. Anholt and Terri had been together for several years. In fact, Terri stood by him even when he went to juvie for 14 months. Over the years, they had 3 pregnancies together that were terminated. Terri, now 19, and Anholt, now 20, are on their 4th pregnancy and decide to keep the baby. On the day of the murder, Terri is 8 months pregnant, and the couple decides they're going to hitchhike from Portland to the Oregon coast. Their first ride dropped them off in Scappoose at the cemetery, and it was raining pretty hard, so the couple went across the street to take shelter in a barn and wait out the rain. While in the barn, Anholt starts to accuse Terri of having another man's baby. In fact, he tells her she needs to repent to Jesus, and the baby is demon seed. The verbal assaults turn physical when he begins to chase her out of the barn, and when he catches her, he punches and kicks her. It gets worse. Go to Part 3. The murder of Terri McCarthy, Part 3. So we've learned from Anholt that he's chased his girlfriend throughout the cemetery, and when he catches her, he begins to kick and punch her. Now it gets worse, and this is not for the faint of heart. When using his hands isn't enough, he begins to stab Terri with items he had with him. The couple had been traveling with camping gear, and he decided to weaponize it. While she was still alive, he stabs her in the abdomen with 6-inch long railroad stakes. These were stakes that they were using to pin their tent into the ground. He then rapes her with broken pieces of a fishing pole and roadside flares. From the autopsy, we learn that Terri died of strangulation and hemorrhaging from her uterus. The attack caused premature labor, and since there were foreign objects in the birth canal, the baby couldn't be born. And since it couldn't be born, he couldn't be charged with its murder. Anholt had a 4-day trial and was sentenced to life in prison in May of 1982. We all have hometown true crime stories, and this one is mine. In May of 2004, 19-year-old Brooke Wilberger was abducted while cleaning outside of her apartments in Corvallis, Oregon. When she didn't return home by 3 p.m., her sister went outside to look for her, but all she found were cleaning supplies and Brooke's flip-flops, which were broken, so she called police. Meanwhile, on the OSU campus, several calls to 911 were made about a man trying to abduct female students. For months, the entire town of Corvallis looked for Brooke, but she was nowhere to be found. Finally, in November of that year, a break in the case. A man named Joel Patrick Courtney abducts and rapes a Russian exchange student in New Mexico. She manages to escape and get to police. They arrest him. After learning that he had a warrant in Corvallis, they called to see if there were any missing women, and bingo, Brooke Wilberger. DNA in his van matched her. It took years and a lot of negotiation, but they finally found her body after he drew a map, and they finally buried Brooke.